Hello, and welcome to HSS 405, Artificial Intelligence and Autonomy. My name is Daniel Estrada. I'm your instructor, and this is the Agency Lectures series. This is the first part of the Agency Lecture series. The goal for this class is to talk about the history of agency and autonomy over the last 2,500 years or so of philosophy, and then to use the debates and the historical context from these debates to approach some more controversial issues like free will, which we'll talk about in Unit 2, and AI and robotics, which will be the subject of Unit 3. I know that most of the students in this class are taking this class to talk about AI and robotics, and we're going to get a lot of chance to do that even in the first two units. But you can think of Unit 1 and 2 as sort of preparation and background introductory material to get us ready to have a really deep and interesting discussion in Unit 3 over AI and robotics. We'll talk about questions like, can machines think? We'll also look at some contemporary AI ethics issues, like the ethics of using facial recognition technology or autonomous weapon systems. And then we'll close out the semester by thinking about robot rights. But this is my agency lecture. These are the lectures for Unit 1. In these lectures, there'll be 4 parts. This first video will be on the history of agency and autonomy. I'll give some introductory remarks, really to set up the next 3 lectures, which will be a little more substantive in terms of content. In the next part, we'll talk about the view that agents are alive, or that they're biological systems. Is there something important about living systems for agency? In part 3, we'll look at the view that agents are machines, or that agency has something to do with mechanical or physical operations. And then Unit 3, we'll talk about consciousness and the idea that agents are essentially thinking things and have some sort of internal subjective experience. These are all distinct views, but they're not necessarily incompatible. And in fact, a lot of this course will be talking about to what extent these different views are compatible. So the point of these videos is to introduce these topics in a systematic way so that we can talk about them in discussion during class periods. Okay, so for this first video, here's the plan. I want to start with just some introductory remarks about what is agency and autonomy to give a sort of very high-level introductory to the conversation. Then I want to introduce my own sort of approach in this class. I'm going to introduce 6 theories of agency. In the class, we're actually going to only go over 4 of them, the 3 from this unit, and then we'll talk about computers in the final unit. I want to introduce the sort of framework for agency that I'm coming from, and also some of the methodological approaches that I'm assuming in this class, just to sort of make clear where I stand on some of these issues. And then I'll end this video with just some historical discussion of, especially for students who haven't taken philosophy classes before, to give a sort of very, very broad overview of the history of philosophy and how I'm breaking it down for our discussions this semester. Okay. So let's go ahead and start by thinking about agency. Let me get my head out of the way here. Okay. So there we go. So natural place to start is thinking about what is an agent. What does it mean to be an agent? And my first pass sort of naive definition, just to get things going, is that an agent is something that does something. Agents do things. Agents act in certain ways. Because of the quirks of the English language and other similar languages, you can render this in either an active or a passive sense. So we might think that agents agents are active in their performance of actions. So you might think that agents perform actions in this active sense. Or you might also have a sort of passive linguistic construction where agents are attributed actions in a more passive way. So for instance, if I have a paperweight, like a rock, and I put it on my paper to keep it from blowing away in the wind, in some sense, the rock is holding the paperweight down, and this is an active way of talking about it. But in some sense, the paper is sort of merely being held down by the paperweight, and the paperweight isn't active in this process. Maybe a rock, you don't want to consider a rock an agent, and so the rock isn't actively performing an action, but merely in virtue of its passive features, just that it has some weight, it's able to hold the paper down. So this is kind of, again, a quirk of language, that there's both an active and passive voice in language, and so we can construct and we can think about the relationship between subjects and verbs in these active and passive ways. Maybe this influences a little bit about the philosophical discussions around agency. When philosophers get a hold of this concept, they tend to make it a little bit more complicated. So here's a slightly, maybe a second pass, a slightly more philosophical brush on agency. Philosophers sometimes like to distinguish between different senses of agent. One you might think of as a causal agent, or an agent something that's an agent in virtue of being part of some causal chain. So maybe the rock is a causal agent in holding the paper down, because it has weight, and that gives it certain physical characteristics that keep the paper from moving in the wind. Or you might think of like a billiard ball game where I hit the cue ball and the cue ball hits another ball and the ball goes into the pocket. So the cue ball is a causal agent in that chain of events, in this series of interactions, physical interactions that move the cue ball to the other ball and into the pocket. So the cue ball is maybe a causal agent, but the cue ball itself didn't start moving from nowhere. I had to hit it with my cue. So the cue ball didn't move from nowhere. I had to hit it with my cue. So maybe the cue ball is only a sort of intermediary agent in this longer causal chain. But we might also think about like the muscles in my arm and the nervous system that goes back to my brain, the signals that are going to my arm to hit the ball in a particular way. That's also a sort of causal chain reaction that goes back to some prior cause, maybe. So one way of worrying about agency is just to worry about how do we trace back these causes to attribute to the cause to some source. One way of answering that question is by thinking that really the source of actions has something to do with an intention, like a mental state where I intend or will something to happen. Like it's because, and when you're playing pool, you have to call where the ball's going to go, right? So if I call the 8-ball in the corner pocket, I'm intending to hit the cue ball in such a way that it hits the 8-ball and puts the 8-ball in the corner pocket. And that's my intention in the sense that it's my plan, it's my goal. And you might think that this is what really matters about agency. The cue ball, as it's rolling down the pool table, it doesn't have any intentions, it doesn't have any goals, it's just sort of mindlessly following the demands of physics. But I'm not merely a causal agent, I'm also an intentional agent, and I have intentions, I have goals and plans that I seek to fulfill, and what makes me an agent and the cue ball not an agent, you might think, is that I have these intentions. It's these intentions that I'm calling out when I say that the cue ball is going to go in the corner pocket. Maybe I get it and maybe I don't. Right? So the intentional agent doesn't always get what they want. But the important part about the intentional agent is that they want something and that they act in a way to achieve those ends. And so maybe what matters about agency is this kind of mental capacity to intend or will some goal state or some end state. Philosophers even go further than this and want to talk about not just the intentions that an agent has, but the responsibility that the agent has for their action and for the results of that action. So a moral agent is an agent who's responsible for their actions, not just that they intend those actions, but that they're actually responsible, culpable for those actions. So what do I mean by responsibility? This is a complicated question, but just, again, as a first pass, you might think responsibility has something to do with with desert, moral desert, with deserving credit or blame. So if I get a reward, so credit is sort of positive responsibility and blame is negative responsibility. If I do something great and I get a reward for it, and someone's like honoring me with some reward, in some sense I'm getting credit for my good deed because they're recognizing my action as a good thing. Or if I do something wrong and I get sent to jail, I'm getting blamed and punished. And in both cases, I deserve that award or that punishment because I did something wrong and I'm responsible for my actions. And it's this responsibility that makes me deserving of credit or blame. And a lot of people think that you have to be a moral agent in order to be genuinely responsible for your actions. So a good contrast case here is something like a child. So if a child, for instance, like a 5-year-old child, somehow gets a hold of a gun and accidentally shoots someone, in some sense, the child is the causal agent of a series of events that leads to someone getting shot. But it's harder to say that the child's responsible in a moral sense for that action because they don't really know what they're doing. The person that's responsible is really the person who left that gun out in a place where the child could reach it. But the child themselves is not really capable of understanding what they're doing, of understanding the consequences of what they're doing. And so we might think that the child is a causal agent, but not a moral agent. And in fact, maybe children can't be moral agents because they're not mature enough. They haven't developed a moral capacity to the point where they're a genuine moral agent. And of course, this is difficult because eventually children become adults, and most adults are morally responsible people that we hold accountable for their actions, right? So if an adult shoots someone, even if it's an accident, to some extent, they're still responsible for that action. So the moral agent here is sometimes contrasted with the moral patient. The moral patient is someone who is deserving of moral concern. We care what happens to them, how they turn out, but are not themselves a moral agent. So maybe children are moral patients in this sense. They're objects of moral concern, but they are not themselves moral agents. Maybe animals are like this, or maybe parts of the environment, maybe even inanimate objects like works of art. Like maybe we have a responsibility to not destroy the Mona Lisa because it's this great work of art that it's very popular. But that doesn't make the Mona Lisa a moral agent. Even if we don't have an obligation, even if we do have an obligation not to hurt it, maybe it's just a moral patient. Maybe it's just something that we should be concerned with. So this is sort of first pass philosophical distinction. We're going to talk about all these things in a lot more detail, but you might think of agency in at least these three different senses: of a causal agent, an intentional agent, and a moral agent. You might also think about the kinds of things that are agents. Instead of trying to decide what the properties of the agents are, you might just try to find like characteristic examples of agents, or maybe like the one property that you need to have in order to be an agent. So here's a big list of different possibilities here about what might be an agent. You might think in the most general sense, an agent is anything that moves, anything that has some kind of physical interaction with its environment. Maybe that's all it is required to be an agent. In fact, motion and things like motion and change were very important to the early philosophical discussions, not just about agency, but about philosophy generally. Trying to explain how motion is possible or how change is possible occupied a lot of the early philosophical discussions. So you might think that what happens when things move is that there's an agent who moves things, and so every kind of motion is a kind of agency. But maybe you're not happy with that. So maybe when a rock is tumbling down a hill, that's not really an agent. It's moving. It's following the forces of gravity and so on as it tumbles down the hill. But that's not really agency because it's moving in this sort of brute physical way, and you need more complicated kinds of agency. You might think you need more complicated kinds of agency in order to be a genuine agent. So maybe the more complicated kind of agency that matters is being alive. Maybe not everything that moves is an agent, but maybe only the things that move in these living ways, the way that a biological organism or maybe just a cell, that these things are alive, and that being alive is a special kind of motion that grants something agency, or that is constitutive of agency. And maybe things that aren't alive, even if they move in very complicated ways, like comets around the sun or something, that's not enough. It's an interesting kind of motion, but it's not enough to be an agent because it's not really alive. Well, what is it about being alive that matters? Some philosophers, when you drill down into this, might argue that what really matters about being alive is that living things are autonomous, is that they're self-directed, that they control themselves in certain kinds of ways in order to achieve their end. And moreover, they're independent. So a living organism, like a cat, will feed itself and take care of itself, and is in this sense autonomous. And it's this kind of autonomy that characterizes not just living creatures, because maybe lots of creatures live in sort of ecosystems or ecological contexts where they need lots of other organisms to survive. But maybe some kinds of creatures are sufficiently autonomous, like my cat, that it can do things to take care of itself in ways that make it an agent, whereas like something like a slime mold or a mushroom maybe are not autonomous in the same way. And again, one of the keys here about autonomy is this idea of self-directed behavior. So maybe it's not just living autonomy that matters, or sort of biological autonomy, but maybe anything that can be sufficiently self-directing, that can set its own goals and work to achieve those goals, is enough to be an agent or an autonomous agent. In fact, this is something that maybe informs some of the robotics discussions around autonomy and agency, is that it really involves self-directed behavior, that a system can set its own goals and achieve those goals under its own power. Maybe setting goals is a kind of mental activity, that's sort of conscious activity, and in order to be a genuine agent, it's not just enough to set your own goals, but you have to do it in this kind of conscious or thinking way. It's sort of characteristic of conscious creatures like us. So maybe agency requires thinking. And maybe it's not just any kind of thinking, but it's really the capacity to act freely, to choose and act freely. Maybe simple animals are conscious in the sense that they have sensations and they feel pain and pleasure, but that they can't make genuine decisions in the free sort of way that human beings do, or at least some human beings do. And so these are all I'm just throwing these all on the table. There's like different senses of agency that might come up in our discussions. And I want to sort of make it clear that these are all legitimate in some way, but they're problematic maybe in other ways. And part of the goal of this semester is to sort all these out, right? So we've already talked about responsibility. Maybe agency has to do with responsibility. Maybe you might think that responsibility has something to do with the social relationship, right? The way that society is structured, and that having responsibility is about being situated in some way in the social space. Like I'm a teacher, and that gives me certain kinds of responsibilities in virtue of my role. And you're students, and you have different responsibilities because you have a different role to play. And so maybe where this responsibility comes from is a sort of situated social status. There's a version of agency that comes up frequently in legal discussions and political discussions. So a legal agent is a legal framework for talking about agency, and a legal agent is someone who has a responsibility to act on someone else's behalf. So my example here is my accountant. My accountant does my taxes. So my accountant is my agent. I hire them to do a job for me, and because I hired them to do that job for me, they first of all, they have a responsibility to me. It's called the legal term here is a fiduciary duty that my accountant is legally obligated to act on my behalf and in my best interests. So my accountant was going to have access to a lot of personal information of mine, my bank accounts and other kinds of financial information, and someone could use that information to hurt me. But I hire the accountant who's licensed and certified and so on, and they have a legal and professional responsibility to act in my interests as my agent. So the legal framework here is that the accountant is my agent, and I'm the principal, and the agent has a fiduciary responsibility to the principal to act on their behalf. So this gives my accountant the ability to do things for me that maybe other people couldn't. So for instance, when I file my taxes, if I was filing my taxes myself, then I would have to sign the form at the end, put my signature on the line at the end. But when I hire my accountant to do my taxes, they can file for me, and that includes signing their name for me on my behalf. And they're legally allowed to do that for me because I've hired them as my agent. So when they're signing their name, they're doing that in my interests and on my behalf. And that's part of the service that they provide and so on. So my accountant is my agent, and my a lawyer is an agent. If you're a movie star, you might have an agent that's getting you gigs and jobs and so on. And these agents, again, have a responsibility to act on your behalf. And this is how the law understands agency. Agency is this sort of relationship between a principal and an agent. So maybe we should be thinking about agency in those sort of terms, in terms of acting on behalf of another. This is pretty far from any of the things before that. Maybe it has something to do with social status and responsibility, but it really doesn't have anything to do with being alive or even being goal-directed. Maybe in some sense the legal agent takes their goals from the principal. Okay, just two more real quick, very general abstract ways of talking about agents. Maybe an agent is anything that can be individuated, right? So maybe the issue here is that when we're talking about something that moves or something that's alive, we're talking about individuals, like sort of single units that are individuated and independent in some way from their surrounding environment. So maybe what matters about agency is just this capacity to individuate. If I can single out something as a thing, maybe that's all that's required to be an agent. Or maybe that's too general. Maybe you want to leave agency to be more specific than that. Here's something more specific. An agent is anything that computes. So in the last unit of this class, I'm going to argue that actually this is maybe the best definition of agency, that agency is really tied up with what computation is. And I'll give some more specific arguments about this, but computation is really a kind of movement, and it's a movement it's not just any kind of movement, but it's a movement in state space. That what computation is about orderly operations in state space. And I think that this idea of orderly operations in state space is really getting at the heart of what it means to be an agent. And so at the end of the semester, my big argument is going to be that, in fact, computation is really at the heart of agency. But that's going to take a lot of unpacking, a lot of arguments to make. My point right now is just that there's a lot of definitions of agency that are on the table that have a lot of relevance for all of these different fields. But these views can't all be right simultaneously. Like, if it's true that agents are alive, that includes more things than just the things that have self-directed behavior or that are have some social status. There's lots of living things that don't have that same kind of social status. So it might be true that all of these are true in some way, or that they're useful in some domains, but they can't all be right at the same time. Some of these definitions rule out others, at least in some contexts. Part of my goal in this class is to sort of sort through all this stuff and think about it a little more clearly and systematically, so that we can have a sort of stronger basis to engage discussions of agency, and especially when we're dealing with things like artificial intelligence, sort of radically novel agents that we might not have existing conceptual frameworks for dealing with, I think going back to these more general notions of agency can be helpful. Okay, so we've talked about agency a little bit. Let's talk about autonomy. Autonomy comes from the Greek words autonomos. So auto means self, and nomos means law. So autonomy is autonomos, means self-law-giving or self-governing. An autonomous system has its own laws or gives itself its own laws. So autonomous systems are self-governing. What it means to be autonomous is to be a self-governing system. And this term comes up a lot in, obviously, political contexts. So when we're talking about certain governments or peoples who have the capacity for a self-government or not. So, maybe there's some ethnic minority in a dictatorship that is very hostile to that minority. And maybe the minority doesn't have any political representation or sort of struggles with political representation. And you might say that that community is not autonomous, or that those people are not autonomous because they're living under the laws of a outside body. Maybe the situation with the Uyghurs in China right now in the concentration camps is an example of a failure of autonomy, that the Uyghurs don't have autonomy because they live under the Chinese regime that is failing to grant them rights and basic respect. So in a political context, maybe we're talking about a country or a region or peoples being able to self-govern. But in general, the idea of autonomy here is something about being free from external control or influence, that's independent, that an autonomous system is independent in some way from control. So this is a very general definition. This is just a Google definition, but we can say here that autonomous agents sort of act of their own accord or decide for themselves what to do. And in this sense, autonomous actions are free. Now, there are two senses here of autonomy that are going to come up and become very important in our discussions this semester. One is, you can see on the screen, about Kantian moral philosophy, that in the philosophical tradition, autonomy has a very central role to play in discussions of moral theory and responsibility. And in some ways, this is as a result of Kant, although people were talking about agency and responsibility in this sense for much longer than that. But in Kant in particular, autonomy is at the very center of moral responsibility. And it's because an autonomous agent is able to act in accordance with objective morality as opposed to just the influences of their desires. So Kant's idea is that if I only do what's pleasurable to me, then I'm sort of succumbing to my passions. But if I reason about how the world ought to be in this sort of objective sense, then I'm able to not only act in response to the world, but I'm also able to decide the rules of morality that apply to my actions. In other words, I'm able to decide for myself what the moral law ought to be. And I can decide for this in an objective way, Kant thinks, so that everyone who's making these kind of moral autonomous decisions, in some sense, will agree about what the moral law is. We can talk more about how Kant does this later. But the point is that to be a responsible agent, you need to be autonomous. The idea is that someone who's not autonomous, who's acting through either under the influence of their desires, maybe like a drug addict, for instance, is not acting autonomously, is not acting of their own law, but is acting sort of through these desires sort of acting through them, making them act in a particular way. Okay, so one big part of the historical discussion of autonomy has to do with this idea that autonomy is central to moral agency. What it means to be a responsible agent is to be a moral agent. But another place where we see the issue of autonomy come up recently is in robotics and artificial intelligence, especially things like these self-driving cars or autonomous vehicles. The idea is that they're autonomous, not in the sense that they're moral agents, not in the sense that they're acting from a sense of objective morality, but simply because they're responding to their environment in these sort of active ways. So for a roboticist, what it means to be autonomous is that an autonomous system, a robot, is autonomous if as it's operating, in the moment of operation, it's free from external control. So when the car is driving down the road, there's no human being with remote control or like a joystick or whatever telling the car what to do moment to moment. The vehicle is autonomous in the sense that its actions in every moment come through a reasoning process about first it senses its environment, and then it reasons about what the best course of action is. So you can see in the screen, this is from one of the Tesla cars. This is a direct feed from the computer in the Tesla car. And you can see how the computer is processing all the information that it has access to. So it's painting the road in front of it green, so it knows where it's okay to drive and where it can't drive. Places that are not green are not okay to drive. There's little red lines marking the lanes. You can also see these little red boxes around. There's a purple box around all of the objects that are that needs to pay attention to, right? Because if it goes too far to the right, it'll run into those cars on the side, and you see there's people walking around and so on. And all of these little objects, the computer is drawing a box around. Sometimes it knows what those things are. It knows that this is a pedestrian, and that's a vehicle, and so on. That's a car, or that's a bicycle. But some of the things it doesn't know, and it just draws boxes around them so that it knows to avoid them, because this is part of the decision-making process. So as this car is driving down the road, there's no engineer with a joystick telling the car what to do. The car is deciding, in some sense, for itself what to do. It's taking this information in, and it's deciding what the best course of action is, and then it's executing on that decision. And it's doing this free from human intervention. Now, for the roboticist, as I said earlier, what matters is that it's free from human intervention in the moment of operation. So when it's actually on the road, there's no one controlling it. However, obviously, this thing was built with a whole team of engineers and software designers, programmers, who built the car to act in exactly this way, told it exactly how to handle all of the things around it. Right, a lot of human effort went into the coding, into the design and testing of this system. What matters to none of that, though, takes away from the robot's autonomy for the roboticist. What matters for the roboticist is that it's autonomous in the moment of operation when it's actually on the road. All of the hundreds or thousands of hours of programming and design that go into the construction of the car doesn't count against its autonomy. As long as no one's controlling it as it's actually driving down the road, then it's autonomous. This sense of autonomy really has nothing to do with the kind of moral agency that Kant's talking about, or that's central to the philosophical discussion. For the philosophical discussion, we're worried about, is the agent deciding for themselves, and so therefore is it responsible for its actions? But none of the roboticists are not saying that the cars in making these decisions are being moral agents, or that they should be held responsible for their actions. Right? There's, in some sense, there's a sort of mismatch of the conversation, that the way that one side of this conversation is using autonomy is just completely different from the way that the other side of the conversation is using autonomy. So part of the goal in this class is to try to bridge these conversations. It's just try to bridge these conversations a bit, and see to what extent the philosophical discussion around autonomy and agency fits with the way that roboticists and ethicists are talking about agency in an artificial intelligence context. You might know the fairly popular at NJIT, because there's a lot of mechanical engineers here. This is the Society for Automotive Engineers. It's an international professional engineering society, people who work on cars. And a few years ago, they released this framework for thinking about autonomy in vehicles. We'll come back to talking about this in a lot more detail, but many of you might have seen this before. The idea is that there's 6 different levels of autonomy, 0 through 5. The first 3 levels, 0, 1, and 2, are the car is not considered autonomous, sort of sub-autonomy, and then these upper 3 levels, 3, 4, and 5, are considered autonomous or semi-autonomous. And all of these levels have to do with how much intervention and control the human being has, who's driving the car. So at level 0, the human is doing basically all of the work. The car is doing very little of the work. But as you go up through the different levels, so level 0 is going to be something like blind spot warnings. So some cars nowadays will beep at you if there's a vehicle in your blind spot and you're about to turn into the lanes, but there's a vehicle in your blind spot, the car will beep at you, or it might even throw on the brakes if something jumped in front of you. So in these cases, the human being is doing most of the driving. The car's only assisting the driver in some limited respects, or having very limited control over what it can do with the car. And this increases to level 1 and 2, which involve things like lane centering or adaptive cruise control. So lane centering, I don't know if you've driven a car that has lane centering, but if you start to swerve or lean to one side or the other of the lane, the car will automatically adjust you back into the center of the lane. Sometimes this can be a little bit jarring because the car sort of feels like it's jerking, like maybe you hit something, but it's really just the car adjusting itself so that you're staying in between the 2 lanes. Right? So this is, again, the car taking some control over the vehicle, over how the vehicle operates, but you still need the person behind the wheel doing most of the work. The car is really just an assistant. When we get to level 3, 4, and 5, the car is taking more responsibility. At level 5, level 5 is supposed to be complete autonomy, where the car is able to drive the vehicle under all conditions. And we don't really have any level 5 autonomy cars. We have a level 4 autonomy car, which is that the car can operate in most conditions, but the human being might not be intervening very much Level 3 autonomy is where most of these Tesla cars are right now. So at level 3 autonomy, the driver's not immediately driving the vehicle, but at level 3 autonomy, the driver must be ready at all times to intervene on the vehicle if something goes wrong. So these Tesla vehicles aren't perfect. They make mistakes. They sometimes get confused by construction or bad weather situations. And in these circumstances, the driver has to be prepared to take over for the car at a moment's notice. The car will start beeping at the driver with a warning, and the driver has to get a hold of the handle of the wheel and take over for the driving. Sometimes they call the Tesla vehicles 2.5 level autonomy because, in fact, you need to be paying a lot of attention. You can't get behind a Tesla vehicle and just like read your phone or read a book or fall asleep because the car can't handle lots of situations, and it'll tell you. And if you're not ready to take over, you're going to be in trouble. This also makes level 3 autonomy very dangerous. For level 3 autonomy, it's not just the vehicle driving and it's not just the human driving, but there's this swapping back and forth. And in fact, this exchange of control between the human and the driver is extremely dangerous. First of all, most drivers are not trained to be robot operators. They're not trained to be system operators. They're trained to drive. And so the kinds of techniques and the kinds of attention that you need to pay in order to monitor one of these vehicles is a little bit different than you might expect if you're driving a car. It's easy to get distracted and look away if you're not paying attention. In fact, people have died this way, both passengers in the car and pedestrians that the cars have hit. And we'll go over a lot of these cases in a little bit. The point here is that the way that we're talking about automation in driving and autonomy in these vehicles is very, very different from the discussion in philosophy. So we're going to try to see if we can't bridge this discussion in a more constructive way. Some of the questions we're going to be asking in this class is how do the different historical discussions of agency and autonomy shape the discourse that we have today? Especially how do these historical perspectives influence the way that we talk about agency and autonomy in robots and artificial intelligence today? And possibly to what extent can these historical debates help us move past some of the argumentative deadlocks and dead ends that we hit in AI and especially in AI ethics today. So my idea is that this historical discussion is going to help us as leverage to answer these questions. Sorry for slipping back and forth. And that we'll be in a better position to deal with these issues. We'll have more conceptual and theoretical resources, but more importantly, we'll sort of understand how these different debates fit into the historical discussions, and so we have a better idea of how to treat them. So some major themes in the course, and hopefully you've already got a sense of this. There's a lot of different ways that people talk about agency and autonomy, and it's been used for a variety of reasons over the last 2,500 years. And part of the approach is that all of these different views on agency and autonomy have arisen, like they don't just come out of nowhere, but they develop out of particular historical and social and political contexts and technological contexts. And these theories are used and become popular because they serve particular interests in the time and place in which they arise. And so understanding those historical contexts will give us a better idea of what's at stake in various approaches to agency and autonomy. In particular, I want to say that some of the debates that we're going to go through in class, like the free will debate, or how life works, or whether machines can think, also debates like human rights, that these things really come out of not just single theories, but interactions between theories over historical time. So it's because of things like the scientific revolution that we look at life and machines in a particular way. And so understanding that historical context will maybe give us better resources for dealing with the theories that come out of them. So this is the big framework that I'm going to be proposing. This is a scary slide, and I'm not going to go through this whole slide. You can go through the slide on your own. But this is the background framework that I'm going to be working from in this first unit of the course. So my idea here is that there's 6 overarching approaches to agency. I have them sort of arranged in this little table in a group of simple theories and sort of refinements on those theories. And I have them broken up into three categories: the pre-scientific, sort of before the scientific revolution, and then the parascientific that exists sort of alongside the scientific theories, and then the scientific theories themselves. So I have 6 theories here to fill out this table. but we're only going to go through the 4 highlighted ones in class. We're going to talk about agents are alive, agents are conscious, agents are machines. This is going to be the subject of our first unit of discussion. We're going to get into the free will debate. I think free will debate is partly a result of confusions among these simple views. But these views don't stay simple over time. My idea is that each of these views get refined in their own ways. So agents are alive becomes agents are souls. And the modern, especially religious or spiritual views of souls derive out of these ancient views of life. Similarly, the idea of socio-political subjects in conversations today sort of derive out of these more basic ideas of thinking subjects. I'm not going to talk too much about souls or socio-political subjects in class. I'll maybe say a little bit about socio-political subjects, especially when we talk about rights and so on. I'm going to say much less about souls. But these are background views that if you're interested in talking about this, please do. These are interesting conversations to have. And just because it's left out of this class because we only have so much time, you are more than welcome to engage these ideas also. The idea that agents are computers derives out of the more basic idea that agents are machines. And I want to, like one of the lessons from this class is that to say that something's a computer is not just the same thing as saying that it's a machine. That in fact, computers are machines, but they're special kinds of machines. And understanding what makes a computer special, what makes a computer unlike a generic machine, is part of what I want to do in the third unit of the class. So we're going to spend time going through all of these all these 4 views. I have this diagram here where they're sort of related like a tree, so that souls comes out of alive, and then there's a split. I'm going to come back to this little intersection point is supposed to be the scientific revolution, and then there's a sort of scientific response to the scientific revolution, and there's the parascientific response. The parascientific response doesn't necessarily disagree with the scientific revolution, but it's generating its views for different sort of reasons. The agents are souls, the religious view, is in some sense a rejection of the scientific revolution. It sort of rejects that whole branch of the argument. I'm going to go through this a little bit later. You don't need to understand this whole thing now, but this is just sort of a big picture view of how I'm grouping all these things together. And what I want to do for the rest of the class is talk a little bit about my methodology in putting together a table like this, but also the sort of historical, big picture historical view that we're going to be operating in, where I want to attribute each one of these 6 views of agency to some historical period. Obviously, this is going to be oversimplifying in all sorts of ways, and this is why I want to start by just saying a few things about methodology. So so there's no dedicated philosophy department at NJIT. A lot of students who are taking this class, this might be your first exposure to philosophy. Maybe you've never really studied or read or researched in philosophy before. And then some of you may have done this quite a lot. There are some humanities classes here at NJIT that do teach philosophy. So maybe you've taken some of those classes and liked it. Maybe you've done some research on your own. Maybe you're a fan of the YouTube philosophers. Those are all legitimate ways of engaging in philosophy. But philosophy is a very broad tent. There's a huge diversity in the methods and approaches that different philosophers take to these topics and debates. These are very abstract topics and debates, so you can approach them from a variety of angles. Just a quick list of different ways of approaching philosophy. Sometimes people focus on thought experiments. This is a very typical way of introducing philosophy, is to talk about really compelling thought experiments. We'll talk about some thought experiments in this class for sure. But the focus of this class will not be on the thought experiments. Another very typical way that philosophy is introduced to new students is by talking about the great thinkers. A certain list, maybe a very narrow list. It tends to be very biased towards Western male thinkers. But sometimes people think of philosophy as consisting of these particular figures in history, Descartes and Kant and Aristotle and Plato and whatever, and that some people approach philosophy by just learning what these great historical thinkers said. Maybe as we go down this list, we're getting to more complicated ways of approaching philosophy. Sometimes philosophers approach philosophy as a sort of historical project. What did these thinkers say? Not just who are these thinkers and sort of what are their big ideas, but really what did they say in the texts? How did what they say relate to what other people said at the same time or maybe afterwards? And this kind of careful historical scholarship, really getting familiar with the texts and time periods in which they were written, with the figures themselves. This kind of historical scholarship is also very useful in philosophy, very helpful. Sometimes Instead of dealing with all the philosophical stuff, sometimes people find the history stuff boring. You have to remember a bunch of dates and figures, and maybe you don't care about those figures, and you don't really see what the relevance of the history is. And so sometimes people just forget all of the history and just go straight to the critical analysis. Happens a lot on YouTube. There's a lot of good YouTube philosophers who do critical analysis of various topics. Um, um, uh, and This kind of critical analysis is very useful. Sometimes you bring in one historical thinker or two, maybe two historical thinkers, to help you, to give you some theoretical tools for dealing with the critical analysis. But often the critical analysis comes from just a careful analysis of the concepts themselves, maybe a little bit of logical argumentation. Maybe the historical analysis and critical analysis isn't enough, but that you really want careful arguments, and maybe professional philosophers in the analytic tradition are more focused on building a careful argument with an explicit series of premises that lead to a definite conclusion. Not every philosopher works by making explicit arguments, especially formal arguments, but some philosophers do. Some people think that it's very important to philosophy. That makes philosophy more like mathematics, where you have to give a proof or a demonstration. But sometimes, instead of a critical analysis of what's wrong or problematic with the concept, maybe just a more general conceptual analysis of how these concepts work and how they relate to each other. I think a lot of philosophy works like this, where it's just sort of, here's a topic, justice, and here's some ways of thinking about justice, and sort of different debates that might arise from thinking about it in these ways. In conceptual analysis, you're not really interested directly in giving a criticism, and you're not just giving careful arguments, but you're really sort of thinking about how these concepts work, how they relate to each other. So all of this stuff is useful, and we will do some of all of these things in class. But I'm having a slightly maybe it's a nerdier approach. It's maybe a little more abstract and difficult of an approach. But it's certainly an approach that appears over and over again in the history of philosophy, and it's this approach of architectonic metaphysics. Architectonic just means like a big systematic structure, and metaphysics is about what things are, or what it means to be a thing, or what it means to be a kind of thing. So architectonic metaphysics are these big systematic frameworks or philosophical views for talking about what exists and how things work and what the relationship is of everything to everything else. Most philosophers don't work like this. Most philosophers are interested in giving careful analysis of some specific concept or maybe some specific piece of media, giving very concrete arguments that are narrow and very specific and very detailed and technical. Or if they're giving broad overviews, they're giving broad overviews for these sort of introductory reasons, talking about these great figures in history or these thought experiments that are supposed to get people excited about the philosophy and ready to do the more careful and rigorous work. But some philosophers, instead of just having this narrow focus on particular concepts, they construct huge worldviews, huge systematic, top-to-bottom explanations of how the world works. Most philosophers don't do this, but there are some historical philosophers that have done this that end up being very popular and end up being very influential in how the discourse over history is shaped. So Aristotle is one of these big architectonic metaphysicians. Aristotle has this whole wide-ranging system that explains what it means to be a thing, what it means to exist, how things are different from each other, how things change in a very abstract way. But he also explains how life works, how reproduction works, how the biological world works. He also explains how cities work and political relations and ethical relations and what it means to be a good government and what it means to be a good person. And he's not just saying stuff about a bunch of different things. He's constructing a whole philosophical framework that ties all of these questions together so that once you know what it is to be a human being, you have some idea of what it means to live a good life or be a good person. And Aristotle's whole philosophy sort of ties all this stuff together. So like I said, this is not how most philosophers do their work. In fact, it's probably a very bad way to work, building these big systematic theories. But it's been done a few times in history. None of them have been perfectly successful. There's problems with all of these grand unifying theories, but it has been tried over and over again, and there are these figures throughout history that are popular, not because they're right, but because they give this grand unifying metaphysics that is very influential in the discussions that happen afterwards. So Aristotle is one of these figures, maybe Thomas Aquinas, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Marx to some extent. Deleuze is maybe a 20th century philosopher doing the same kind of thing. All these philosophers have these big architectonic metaphysics. These are not the philosophers that you usually read when you're in an introduction to philosophy class, because at an introductory level, you just want to get excited about the philosophy. And these are sort of the philosophers. These are the philosophers that philosophers like to read and talk about, and sort of frame our discussions about everything else. And sometimes you have a favorite one of these philosophers that you study completely. There's a lot of people who are strictly Kantians or strictly Hegelians and analyze everything from the worldview that Hegel developed, or sort of the refinements of that view that happened over scholarship over the last few hundred years. So this is the structure of the class. I'm not going to be treating this as an introductory class, even though I know that many of you are not familiar with philosophers or philosophy very much. But my goal, because I want to have this big picture discussion, my goal for some of the historical introduction is to situate these big architectonic thinkers and think about what they're saying and how they sort of influence the discourse. So this is another version of the same agency table that I had up before, but it's maybe a little bit more organized. Here are the big thinkers in each of these different historical periods. And here I have 6 different periods, and each one is attached to a particular thinker. And each one of these thinkers is attached to a different view of what it means to be an agent. So this table is kind of a cheat. Like maybe the term agent doesn't really come up in ancient philosophy. Like I don't know that Aristotle really talks about agents so much as he talks about organisms. So like I'm sort of cheating in a variety of ways to make this table fit. And you shouldn't take this table as like the most accurate bit of research on what these thinkers actually think. Like I don't think any of these questions were actually said by any of these thinkers. So don't attribute these questions to any of these thinkers. But this is sort of just generally how I'm thinking about the different periods of history, who the characteristic thinker of that period is, and how they're thinking about agency in this very general sense. So we're going to be talking about only 4 of these periods, the ones that are highlighted. So the Silk Road, in the Silk Road period, we'll talk about Aristotle. In the early scientific revolution, we'll talk about Descartes. In the political revolutions of the 1700s, the 18th century, we'll talk about Kant. In the 19th century, industrial revolutions, Marx is a natural figure to talk about here, but we're not going to say too much about Marx or the socio-political subject. What we will do, though, is talk about the 20th century and Turing and what it means to be a computer. So these highlighted ones are the ones that will be our focus. These tables and these diagrams that I'm showing in the slides, these are really like cheat sheets. It's not the slide. It's not the slide in the slide deck as we're going through it right now. This is really for you to study and look back at afterwards, after the lecture, and sort of figure out what's going on. So I'm not going to go through all these boxes right now. Hopefully over the next few lectures, we'll see how this table really works. Let me just quickly say a couple of things about the drawbacks of my approach. So first of all, these big architectonic frameworks are not very easy to learn. They're not very sort of inviting. They're big and sometimes scary, a little bit intimidating. Also, talking about so many big theories risks oversimplifying the theories and losing some of the clarity and rigor that went into the original theories. Right? Or trying to compare them all and fit them into these nice little boxes is obviously going to lose some clarity and precision. So the tables that you've seen, the diagrams that you've seen are clearly distorted for the purposes of the narrative that I'm trying to build. And that's it's a drawback of the theory, it's a drawback of the approach. It's also not a very popular approach. People don't like giving these sweeping historical narratives or trying to tell these big picture stories because they're going to fail in all these ways. Maybe most obviously, my approach here is mostly Western philosophers, mostly men, and that gives a very narrow reading of the history of philosophy. And even granting that narrowness, even just restricting our focus to Western philosophy, it's not the case that a single figure can represent an entire domain. So I have Aristotle speaking for like 2,000 years of ancient philosophy. And of those 2,000 years, actually very few people completely agreed with Aristotle. I want to say almost no one agreed completely with Aristotle. Everyone had their own little twists and turns in Aristotle, and some people rejected the framework outright and gave completely different frameworks and so on. So to say that Aristotle is characteristic of this period is not to say that everyone believed him during this period. That certainly is not the case. I'm using this as just a sort of entry point to organize our thoughts about these different views. I'm using Aristotle partly because I like Aristotle and I know the view well, and partly because it fits into this bigger picture narrative that I want to give. But these are all rough approximations and caricatures, and I encourage all of you students and anyone else who's watching to challenge these frameworks in whichever ways you see are appropriate. Find better thinkers and better questions to characterize these different periods in history. So I want to agree with all of these criticisms that yes, it's true that these are drawbacks of my approach, and going forward, just keep in mind that these are drawbacks. That I'm not trying to give a perfect historical account, but I'm really trying to tell a narrative that helps tie it all together in a way that encourages you to do further research. So those are drawbacks. Here's some advantages to my approach. Maybe these sweeping historical narratives are easier to approach and engage when we're doing a lot of them, so we can sort of more easily get to particular points we want to bring up. You might find these big historical narratives intimidating, so please go through the readings and find things that you actually like to engage. But maybe having a sense of these big picture narratives can help situate a lot of the other discussion that we'll have. So if you understand, for instance, what Descartes is doing at the beginning of the scientific revolutions, maybe you have a better sense of what's happening for other thinkers during the same period. But yeah, the point is to allow us to focus in on particular issues without getting caught up in a lot of the mid-sized details. So I don't want to construct a big framework from scratch. I want to sort of pick up all these big frameworks, but I want to use them to triangulate on issues that matter to me. The guiding lesson here is from Rosie Braidotti, who says that philosophy is a subtle science. And so we're going to try to be subtle and careful, and we're going to try to recognize the complexities and nuances in what we're talking about, even while we're making these big, broad brushstrokes throughout history. Yeah, and the biggest advantage of this approach, the reason why I'm doing it, is because it lets me tell the story that I want to tell about AI and robotics today. I want to sort of trace this trajectory through history so we can land on the discussions we're having today. And it's really that advantage that I think outweighs the disadvantages, at least for the purposes of this class and this lecture series. Just about my own philosophical views, I'm somewhat biased towards American pragmatism. Pragmatism is basically the view that you go with what works. And pragmatism has refined a few times over the years the sort of early pragmatists like Dewey and James and Peirce, and the mid-20th century pragmatists like Quine and Rorty, and then the late 20th century pragmatists like Dennett and Hoagland are big influences on my work and how I'm thinking about these things. Some of these people are also pretty comprehensive thinkers. Maybe Sellers and Dewey in particular had these very broad views that sort of go across both sciences and the humanities to tie a big picture worldview together. So I take myself as following in this tradition to some extent. That said, I'm not going to be teaching you the pragmatist's view on agency or anything like that. I'm trying to give you a historical view on agency that's informed by my pragmatic sensibilities. Another one of the biases that's going to influence this discussion, I'll just put it on the table right now, is that I'm fairly well convinced that computers are agents, in the sense that I'll say, especially in Unit 3, just in the sense that computers are finite state machines, and they go through orderly operations through state space. And that's what it means to be a computer, and I think that's what it also means to be an agent. My view here is inspired by Turing, and especially Turing's idea of fair play for machines. And you'll see some of my own views in Unit 3 on artificial intelligence and AI ethics that come out of Turing's fair play for machines. Another thing to say about my biases is that as I'm sort of sympathetic to these historical architectonics, I'm skeptical that any of them should be believed 100%. I don't think any of the ones that we're going to talk about in class should be believed 100%. And in all honesty, I don't really believe any of them. Maybe Turing to some extent, but the rest of the views I'm not a subscriber to. I'm not an Aristotelian or a Kantian or a Cartesian. But I think these views are helpful, and so I'm going to try to give them my best shot to explain them to you and make you see how they're useful and relevant to the discussions we're going to have. I think these views are useful, and I have a lot of positive things to say about them. I also think they're wrong in very important respects, and so I'm going to both try to defend these views and also attack them. And in general, this is again part of my pragmatism, is that I'm going to have a sort of ironic stance towards these views. I think we shouldn't be committed to any strong view of agency, and that we should be sort of playful about these views and see how they work in different contexts and try to take what's good about them and try to leave aside what's bad about them. So I'm going to try to stay playful about the stuff in class. I'm not trying to convince you of any one of these views or convince you against any one of these views. But I'm just being upfront about my biases before we get going. The last thing I have here in this slide deck, and we'll probably pull up these images later on in the semester, but I have a timeline of philosophers. If you've never been in a philosophy class before, you might have heard some of these names, but you might not be very familiar with a lot of who these philosophers are, or how they relate to each other. So a couple of years ago, I was looking for a timeline for this class to sort of introduce some of these philosophical relationships, and I couldn't find a good timeline, so I made one. So here's my timeline. It's in a bunch of different parts, and you can go on the website on Canvas and find the full image, so you can scroll through and see everyone says. But I'm basically dividing history into a couple of different sections. The first section I'm calling Silk Road philosophy. Silk Road philosophy is basically the ancient world, not just ancient Greece. So Socrates and Plato is Socrates is a student, and then Aristotle is the student of Plato. So the sort of Socrates to Plato to Aristotle is like the traditional philosophy, classic Greek philosophy goes from Socrates, Plato to Aristotle. There are Greek philosophers before Socrates, the so-called pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus and Anaxagoras and Anaximander. These are the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. But Greek philosophy really starts after and alongside both Chinese philosophy and Indian philosophy, which to some extent comes before, at least significantly before Socrates, but even before some of the pre-Socratics. So if you go through history books about philosophy, maybe I should say that human civilization starts like 10,000 BC. So like 10,000 years before this image, human beings are settling down in civilizations. They're starting to farm and do agriculture, starting to domesticate plants and animals, like 12,000 or 10,000 years ago. And cradle of civilization starts significantly around 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. So there's already civilization up and running thousands of years before the Greeks and all this ancient, what we call ancient philosophy, really gets off the ground. But you can see that there's a boom that happens, a pretty significant boom that happens in thinking all around the world, right around 500 BC, 600 BC. BCE, before the Common Era, before zero, there was a boom not just in Greece, but also in India and China, to some extent independently, but these different civilizations were all connected to some extent by the Silk Road. Silk Road was a trading route that went from Far East and China through India and into the Mediterranean, into Greece, into Egypt, and other Mediterranean civilizations. And this Silk Road transportation route, trade route, brought silk and other goods back and forth across the region. It brought silk from China out to Greece. But it also brought ideas and theories and science and tools and technology. And so the Silk Road was like the ancient world's internet. It connected the ancient world. And so it's partly this connection that leads to this blossoming of philosophical views. And from that perspective, the Greek blossoming of views, especially with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, happens a little bit later than what happens in India and China. And it goes for a while. In the Western world, we talk about the fall of Rome, which happens around 580. So Plato and Aristotle become like really important philosophers until around 500 AD in Europe. And in Europe, then Constantine becomes emperor of Rome and converts Rome to Christianity. And then afterwards, it becomes heretical to study the ancient Greek philosophers because they were pagan, they weren't Christian. So around 500 BC, with the rise of Constantine, you have what is sometimes called the Dark Ages. And it's the Dark Ages precisely because Greek philosophy was no longer allowed to be studied. So there's this period of time for about 1,000 years, from about 500 to about 1200 BC or so, where scholars in Europe were allowed to study the Bible, they were allowed to study other Roman thinkers, but they weren't allowed to study the Greeks and pre-Socratics before they'd become Christian. And what that means is that a lot of the philosophy during this time, a lot of the philosophy and the science and the medicine was done in the Islamic world. So from about 600 to about 1400 or so, 1200 or so, is what's called the Islamic Golden Age. Islamic Golden Age is where all the important intellectual and philosophical and scientific and mathematical discoveries and progress was being made in the Islamic world. Uh, so a lot of the philosophical thinkers that you see mentioned here are Islamic, and in Europe they were going through the Dark Ages where there wasn't a whole lot of philosophy being done. This sort of changes around 1200 AD. After the Crusades, some of the European kings decided that they would like to take back the Holy Land, in their terms, which means going into the Middle East, into these Islamic and Arabic empires, and fighting. The Europeans mostly lost these crusades, these wars, but when they would return to Europe, they would bring some of the scholarship with them, including some of the original, some of the translations from Aristotle and Plato that Arabic scholars and Islamic scholars had been maintaining for thousands of years. And it's really this reintroduction of these Aristotelian texts back into Europe, where they had been lost for 1,000 years. But the reintroduction, partly as a result of the Islamic scholarship, that Aristotle in particular is reintroduced to the West, and figures such as Thomas Aquinas and others start going back through this ancient Greek philosophy and incorporating it with European theology, especially Catholicism. So Thomas Aquinas is a Catholic saint, but at the time he was a Aristotle scholar. He was reading Aristotle, and he was reading Ibn Sina, Averroes, Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd is Averroes in Latin, and St. Thomas Aquinas and Averroes did commentaries on Aristotle, and both Averroes's commentaries and the original Aristotelian texts somehow make it back to Aquinas, and Aquinas writes these very important treatise on Aristotle and theology. It's called the Summa Theologica. This sort of they say Aquinas baptizes Aristotle into Catholicism, so that the Catholic Church ends up adopting a lot of Aristotelian themes. And this is the situation right before the scientific revolution. You can see at the end of the 1500s, people like Giordano Bruno and Tycho Brahe are starting to do experimental science. They're starting to study the stars and the planets and other sort of physical phenomena. And they eventually do this in a way that conflicts with the Catholic Church. And there's this, what's going to be called the scientific revolution. In school, you're often taught the scientific revolution is a fight between science and Catholicism. But what's really important is that Catholicism isn't just the biblical views, but it's also these Aristotelian views from the ancient world that sort of get translated through Catholicism into the modern world. So when the early scientists like Galileo were questioning religious dogma, it wasn't just religious dogma, it was dogma that had been inherited from Aristotle. When people thought that the Earth was at the center of the solar system. This is an Aristotelian idea. It gets refined by Ptolemy, but it's argued by Aristotle. And we'll see how those arguments work in the next lesson. But the point here is that the scientific revolution isn't a revolution against religion. It's a revolution against Aristotle. That what the early scientists were rejecting were these particular Aristotelian notions, not really of God, more of things like teleology and purpose, a natural purpose. The early scientists basically reject the idea of a natural purpose. And this is what a lot of the fight between science and Aristotle amounts to. And this fight goes on through the 1700s and into the 1800s with Darwin and some of the modern biological theories. The ancient worldviews really don't get definitively disproven or rejected by modern science until the mid-1800s. So the 20th century is really the start of a new scientific age. Maybe the 1800s is the start of a new scientific age with thermodynamics and so on. But I'm going to be attributing one of these theories of agency to each of these views. So to the ancient world, I'm going to attribute the view that agents are alive, that agents are living organisms. To the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, with figures like Aquinas and Averroes, maybe the view is that the agents are souls, or the agents have a soul, and that's what really matters about agency. But like I said, we're not going to talk too much about this. For the scientific revolution, this is where we get the idea that agency is about a machine, that what's fundamental to agency are these mechanical relationships. From the political revolution of the 1700s, we get the view that agency is about autonomy from Kant, or that it's about rights and responsibility from people like Hume and Locke and so on. In the 1800s, we have the Industrial Revolution. We have the sciences of thermodynamics and electricity and so on start to get harnessed. We have evolutionary theory. Sciences really explode in the 1800s, and so do our philosophical and theoretical views, especially in politics. So Marx is from this era. Hegel is from this era. And then finally, in the 20th century, we have the digital views like computer science from Turing and other early cybernetics, like from Norbert Wiener and so on. John von Neumann is also very important in developing computers. And this is where we get the view that agents are fundamentally about computation, and this is the place where we are now. So that was a really just brief overview of the history. If you want to look more closely at these images and find people that you're interested in, how they relate to each other, there's a lot of things I learned from making this timeline, just because it took a lot of effort. So let me just point out a couple of things. For one thing, I didn't know how long Thomas Hobbes lived. Hobbes lived forever. Hobbes lived from the late 1800s all the way to 1679. He lived almost to be 90 years old. He was 91 years old. Thomas Hobbes lived a very long time. In 1600s to live to 91. It's a pretty huge feat. Hobbes outlived a bunch of his contemporaries. So these kinds of things are fun. You also see people who died too young, like Turing or Frank Ramsey or John von Neumann even, maybe. So a lot of interesting philosophers in here. You might find philosophers you're interested in studying, maybe see a little bit better about the relationship to each other. This is the last slide. I just want to relate this back to the 6 theories of agency. So each of these theories of agency are being attributed to a different period in that history, and then refinements of these views. So ancient to the medieval or Dark Age philosophy are these pre-scientific views. And then again, this intersection that splits off the contemporary views into the parascientific and scientific. Parascientific here doesn't mean that they're against science, but just that they exist alongside science, and that it's not grounded in science. So thinking about agents as self-conscious subjects, part of the challenge of this is how do we relate self-consciousness to the mechanical relationships that we see in physics. And to some extent, the people on this parascientific side don't care about that relationship, or even maybe actively reject that relationship, but are otherwise sort of ambivalent about whether or not you can cash out consciousness in terms of mechanical relationships. The scientists on the far side in the scientific view are much more adamant that these are scientific descriptions that you can describe in mechanical terms, but maybe consciousness is not like that. Maybe sociopolitical status, maybe being a sociopolitical subject is not just a mechanical relationship. And so a lot of the contemporary debate comes out of arguments between these two views, between the parascientific and the scientific. There are also arguments between the scientific and the pre-scientific, in particular the view that agents are souls. But I don't think the argument between agents are souls and agents are machines is the same as the argument between agents are self-conscious subjects and agents are machines. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so, again, part of the point of this first round of lectures, these first 4 lectures on agency, is to help sort out the relationship between these different views. We're going to mostly be sticking in this class to the simple views. The computers are going to be a refinement of the machines. But please engage any of these views. They're interesting. Hopefully, by the end of this lecture series, this diagram makes a little more sense, and you have a little bit of a better understanding of how these views all relate to each other. Okay, that's it. That's my introductory lecture on agency and autonomy. I will be putting up the lecture on agents are alive and Aristotle next. But hopefully, this is an hour-long lecture. Hopefully, you enjoyed it. It wasn't too boring. Hopefully, you got through it. I'll see you soon.